While MTG has multiple vocational creature types, one of the earliest introduced was Knights in Alpha. Even with the Soldier and Warrior creature types competing for design space and members, there have been hundreds of Knights printed throughout the course of the game's history. The former Paladin creature type was eventually combined with Knight creature type under the latter's name. Knights have seen a renewed stint of design focus in Throne of Eldraine, yet Knight-focused decks have yet to really make a competitive impact. That said, multiple individual Knight cards throughout the years have found success in multiple competitive formats. Starting us off at number 10, we have Hero of Bladehold. This human Knight costs 2 generic and 2 white mana. It has 3 power, 4 toughness, and the keyword ability, Battlecry. This means whenever Hero Bladehold attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1 power until the end of turn. Hero Bladehold also has an ability where whenever it attacks, you create 2 soldier creature tokens with 1 power and toughness that are also tapped and attacking. You're able to stack these triggers in an order where the token's creations resolve first, meaning these tokens will actually attack with 2 power. When this card was first printed and mirrored in Visage, it became the centerpiece of an aggressive token deck in Standard for the sheer amount of damage output it provided. Between itself and the 2 tokens, it represented 7 power, and the Battlecry ability ensured every other creature gets just a bit more damage too. The card proved successful in various modern decks throughout the next few years, most often in black-white token decks. Combined with Lingering Souls, creating fly tokens that could only be blocked with creatures with flying or reach, and the various other token decks they produced, Hero Bladehold functioned as the top end of the deck's mana curve. As years passed, however, the card fell out of favor along with token decks that had been prominent in. These days, the card generally is too slow for any constructed format. Similar cards such as Brumaz, King of Oreskos would see more longevity in non-rotating formats for their better mana efficiency or flexibility. While no longer a relevant card in competitive formats, Hero Bladehold was once an extremely dominant card, and worth the 10th spot on this list over less impactful Knights that might have seen more play recently. And at number 9, we have Midnight Reaper. With a cost of 2 generic and 1 black mana, Midnight Reaper is a zombie knight with 3 power and 2 toughness. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Midnight Reaper deals 1 damage to you and you draw a card. Although it did drain one's life total, Midnight Reaper's effect allowed red-black decks in its standard format to leverage recursive creatures like Gutterbones for a card advantage engine. Midnight Reaper would often draw multiple cards before being removed and would help someone recover in case of a board wipe. Even if Midnight Reaper itself dies, it still sees the other creatures die with it, and as such, will draw a card for all of them. The card has gone on to see play in MTG's Arena's historic format and Jund Sacrifice decks. Those decks are built around sacrificing on creatures to the effects of Priest of Forgotten Gods. Midnight Reaper provided even further advantage to those decks and allowed them to draw multiple cards a turn. However, Midnight Reaper's effectiveness is limited, as the Pioneer format and by extension all formats with older card pools have access to Grim Haruspex, which has the same mana value but doesn't deal any damage to you. Midnight Reaper does, however, have the zombie creature type, which is relevant if a zombie-themed deck ever does become prominent in Pioneer. Mono-black aggro decks in the format have experimented, however, even then, many builds of these zombie decks don't even run Midnight Reaper at all, favoring more aggressive cards. Especially since zombie decks also have access to card draw at lower mana values thanks to Crypt Breaker. As such, Midnight Reaper remains a somewhat narrow, yet at the time not entirely irrelevant option, and was quite potent during its time in Standard as well. And coming in at number 8, we have Knight of the White Orchid. This is a human knight which costs 2 white mana and has 2 power and toughness. It has First Strike, meaning it deals damage in combat for creatures without First Strike. This means if the creature has 2 or less toughness, Knight of the White Orchid will kill it in combat without taking any damage itself. Beyond this effect, it also has the ability that whenever it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for a Plains card and put it into the battlefield. Generally speaking, green is the only color that gets to search lands and put them directly on the battlefield. White sometimes searches lands when another player controls more, but even then, those lands are usually put in hand instead of on the battlefield. As such, Knight of the White Orchid allows you to actively get ahead on mana if you play before playing your land for turn to catch up to then pass your opponent on land count. This has led to the card seeing play in aggressive white decks since it's printing in Shards of Alara. However, this card does not specifically search basic plains, which has led to the card seeing play in multicolored decks, or even having those primarily white decks splashed a second color. While Knight of the White Orchid does specify it has to be a plains, it can be a card like Irrigated Farmland that has the plains basic land type. In recent years, Knight of the White Orchid has found its most consistent home in the Pioneer format. Beyond aggressive white decks, decks built around the Devotion mechanic have also taken to the card. Devotion is a mechanic that cares about how much of a given color's mana symbols appear on permanents you control. So decks built around Devotion to White prefer Knight of the White Orchid over other 2 mana value creatures since it adds 2 points towards Devotion instead of 1. Of course, while there are decks that do play the card, they've never really been the most competitively viable and are generally more rogue options. While Knight of the White Orchid has certainly seen play for many years, it's not a level of play wide enough to get any higher than 8th on this list. And at number 7, we have Murderous Rider. This knight zombie costs 1 generic and 2 black mana, as well as having 2 power and 3 toughness. Murderous Rider also has lifelink, a keyword ability which means whenever it deals damage, you gain that much life. Whenever Murderous Rider dies, put it onto the bottom of its owner's library. By itself, this somewhat recursive creature won't do much, but Murderous Rider has an adventure spell attached to it. Adventures are a type of instant and sorcery that are part of permanent spells. Instead of simply casting Murderous Rider, you can instead cast Swift End, an instant that costs 1 generic and 2 black mana that destroys target creature or planeswalker and causes you to lose 2 life. And after casting an adventure spell, instead of it going to the graveyard like most other instants and sorceries, instead it exiles itself on an adventure. From there, you're allowed to cast the creature portion of the card as if it were in your hand. With this in mind, Murderous Rider's ability to put itself back into the deck is actually a way to refill your deck with removal. Of course, this is somewhat expensive compared to a traditional removal spell such as Fatal Push. However, whereas those removal spells have a lower mana value at the trade-off of being able to kill less things, Murderous Rider is able to kill just about any creature planeswalker without protection. Of course, some formats simply need faster interaction, and as such, Murderous Rider has not seen much success in formats such as Modern or Legacy. However, even after its time in Standard, Murderous Rider has found a home in black control decks in Pioneer. These decks tend to be slower than more typically aggressive black decks in Pioneer, leveraging Murderous Rider as both interaction and a body to help gum up the board and gain back some life in aggressive matchups. These decks tend to run less than a full playset of the card, however, since while it can remove just about any creature, the lower mana value options are better to draw into those early turns, even if they're more narrow. Power Word Kill, for example, offers less value than Murderous Rider in the long run, but can be cast a whole turn quicker, which makes a world of difference in competitive formats. And at number 6, we have Knight of the Ebon Legion. For just a single black mana, you get a Vampire Knight with 1 power and 2 toughness. It is an ability where you may pay 2 generic and 1 black mana to give it plus 3 power and toughness as well as Death Touch until the end of turn. This means Knight of the Ebon Legion now has 4 power, 5 toughness, and thanks to Death Touch, any creature it deals damage to will die as if it had taken lethal damage. This allows for Knight of the Ebon Legion to threaten any opponent who might try to block it. As long as you have 3 mana untapped, you're able to swing with Knight of the Ebon Legion and activate the ability at instant speed. This can force your opponent into unfavorable blocks, or force them to just let the Knight attack freely out of fear of losing one of the creatures to Death Touch. This problem only gets further out of hand with Knight of the Ebon Legion's second effect. At the beginning of your end step, if a player lost 4 or more life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this card. 4 damage is exactly enough for Knight of the Ebon Legion after using its first ability, can deal enough damage to give itself the counter. And in practice, opponents are forced between jump blocking the Knight or allowed to just get even bigger. And other forms of life loss count as well, which is especially relevant with Sheoldred, the Apocalypse, and Pioneer. Aggressive black decks use Knight of the Ebon Legion as part of the lineup of aggressive 1 mana value creatures. As a creature that can scale through the game, it provides an answer for when your opponents are able to wall up with large creatures that could otherwise easily block the smaller creatures in the deck. Given that this card is also a vampire, it has seen play as the prime 1-drop of those decks as well. In particular, the card combines well with Sorin, Imperious Bloodlord, who is able to put counters onto the Knight of the Ebon Legion as well as giving it lifelink and Death Touch. Like previous cards on this list, one aspect holding this card back is that older formats like Modern have stronger, wider card pools with less room for Knight of the Ebon Legion to stand out. And at number 5, we have Knight of Autumn. This Dryad Knight costs 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 white mana. It has 2 power and 1 toughness, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one of 3 abilities. You may put 2 +1/+1 counters on Knight of Autumn, giving it a total of 4 power and 3 toughness. You may instead destroy target artifact or enchantment, or you may simply gain 4 life. On their own, only one of these effects will be really worth running, the destroying an artifact or enchantment option. But there are similar cards that do this that are easier to cast. These cards don't see much play in competitive formats because there's no real guarantee that you'll be facing decks with important artifacts or enchantments to destroy. So what makes Knight of Autumn good is the flexibility. In creature-focused decks, if there are no enchantments or artifacts causing problems, Knight of Autumn can instead be a decent 3 mana value attacker, or help gain some life back in the late game. Whereas a card such as Reclamation Sage would be relatively worthless in this scenario without good stats or anything else really going for it. Knight of Autumn's worst case scenarios are at the very least passable, and in the appropriate matchup, the card is extremely important. Legacy Maverick decks often run a single copy of it given how easy it is to search out with cards such as Green Sun Zenith in the deck. In general, creature toolbox decks in various formats often run the card in some numbers as long as they're playing both green and white. And beyond main deck play, the card is even more common in sideboards where it can be brought in specifically to answer problematic permanents. Their interaction's power comes from being situationally effective. A Knight of Autumn is more effective in more situations than many cards similar to it. And at number 4, we have Cavalier of the Thorns. This Elemental Knight costs 2 generic and 3 green mana and has 5 power and 6 toughness. It also has the keyword ability Reach, which allows it to block creatures with the flying keyword who otherwise wouldn't be blockable. When Cavalier of Thorns enters the battlefield, you reveal the top 5 cards of your library, put a land card from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest into your graveyard. Unlike many effects that grab lands from the deck, this grabs any land you see in the top 5, not just a basic one. Whenever this card dies, you may exile it, and if you do, put another target card from your graveyard on top of your library. These two abilities combined means that if Cavalier of Thorns ever finds a powerful card when it enters the battlefield and puts it into the graveyard, As soon as it dies, you're able to get that card back. While the card was dominant in Standard, its real home came in the form of Devotion to Green decks in the Pioneer format. Beyond having 3 green mana symbols in its cost to help towards devotion count, the card is able to find the deck's most important card, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, as soon as possible. The deck aims to add as much mana as possible by tapping Nykthos with high Devotion to Green. Storm of the Festival tends to be the card the deck attempts to cast most with all this mana, and seeing as how it can be cast from the graveyard, it doesn't matter if Cavalier of Thorns mills it or not. Storm of the Festival is even able to grab more copies of Cavalier of Thorns and keep the value going. While the card has seen play in other formats to less success, Devotion to Green at the time of recording has proven to be one of Pioneer's most dominant decks. While Cavalier of Thorns is certainly a large part of the deck's success, it doesn't quite break it into the top 3, as the next 3 knights on this list have seen consistent play in a wider variety of formats and still do to this day. And at number 3, we have Fervent Champion. For 1 red mana, you get a human knight with 1 power and toughness. Fervent Champion has the aforementioned keyword ability First Strike as well as the keyword ability Haste, which essentially removes its summoning sickness and allows it to attack the turn that you cast it. Whenever it attacks, another attacking knight gets +1 power until the end of turn. The equip abilities cost 3 less to activate when they target Fervent Champion as well. This knight is from Throne of Eldraine and as such was designed to be played alongside other knights. And while this card does see play in knight-focused decks, the card has seen play in decks where it is the only knight. Back in Standard, Fervent Champion was part of a red-green aggro deck thanks to coming down early and helping cast the combat trick equipment, Embercleave. Even after rotation, the card has seen success in Pioneer aggro decks, but has seen more impact in the Modern format after Modern Horizons 2. With the printing of Ravagan Nimble Pilferer, Modern saw the rise of Monkey Blade decks, which aim to run small, aggressive creatures, ways to protect them, and powerful equipment. Fervent Champion quickly took a slot in one of the secondary threat options behind the namesake Monkey Ravagan. It costs 0 mana to equip Sword of Fire and Ice to Fervent Champion, and as such, it allows for these aggressive red-white decks to diversify the threats without sacrificing too much of their available mana. Fervent Champion is at its best when another copy of itself is on the board, seeing as how otherwise in these decks, its power boosting effect rarely comes up. For just a 1 mana value creature with 1 power and toughness, Fervent Champion provides a great deal of value to these low to the ground aggressive decks. And at number 2, we have Puresteel Paladin. This human knight costs 2 white mana and also has 2 power and toughness. Its first effect is that when an equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. It also gives all equipment you control an equip cost to 0 as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. This means not only does each equipment you cost replace itself card advantage wise, as long as you have 3 of them, you're able to freely move them around your creatures as you like. The main downside of equipment is that it often requires further investment of mana to equip it to a creature after casting it. Puresteel Paladin avoids this downside by removing the cost altogether. Of course, equipment abilities like this can only be activated at sorcery speed, but even then the effect is quite potent. For many years after its time in Standard, Puresteel Paladin's primary use case was in a combo deck commonly known as Cheerios. This deck got its name from the number of 0 mana value artifacts it ran, the namesake Cheerios. Each 0 mana equipment drew another card and kept the chain going. Ideally, you'd have multiple Puresteel Paladins on the board throughout the course of this and would draw even more cards before eventually casting enough spells that a single grape shot is lethal. Although the deck still exists, in recent years Puresteel Paladin has found even higher level success in more conventional equipment strategies. Colossus Hammer in particular has become the main build-around card, an equipment with a mana value of 1 that provides 10 power and toughness with a drawback of requiring 8 mana to equip. Thanks to Puresteel Paladin, instead, you can simply pay 0 to equip it and give whichever creature you'd like a rather sizable boost in power. 2 copies of Colossus Hammer on a small creature like the Ornithopter is outright lethal. From there, the deck simply tries to put the hammer on a creature that's hard or impossible to block and win the game. As of the time of recording, Hammer Time is one of the most dominant decks in the Modern format, and has seen experimentation in other formats as well. Puresteel Paladin, since its printing, has been used in a wide variety of equipment strategies as an integral card. But there is still one more knight that has seen more play and impact. And finally, at number 1, we have Knight of the Reliquary. This 2 power and toughness human knight costs 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 white mana. You may tap it and sacrifice a plains or forest to search your library for a land card and put it into play. This card also gets +1 power and toughness for each land card in your graveyard. Even just its tapping effect is quite potent. It doesn't matter if the land you sacrifice has already been tapped for mana itself, meaning you can float a mana, sacrifice it to Knight of the Reliquary, then get a new untapped land and tap it for mana. Combined with Lotus Cobra and Standard at the time of its printing, these two together formed a mana acceleration engine potent enough to turbo out powerful cards and top 3 GPs in 2010, as well as winning one of them. Over time, Knight of the Reliquary saw play in just about every format. Modern collected company decks use the card both as a high power attacker, but also to find any one of the lands the deck might run for niche scenarios. In these non-rotating formats like Modern, the existence of fetch lands only made Knight of Reliquary stronger. Fetch lands sacrifice themselves to grab another land for the deck, and as such incidentally fell into Knight of the Reliquary's power and toughness growing. While Modern has somewhat moved away from Knight of the Reliquary, the card to this day remains prominent in the Legacy format. There it is used as a key part of Dark Depth's land combo decks. Both halves of the combo, Dark Depths and Thespian Stage, are lands, meaning that Knight of the Reliquary can search up whichever half is needed at the time. The deck also runs copies of Sujiri Steppe, a land that upon entering the battlefield can protect a creature. So Knight of the Reliquary is both able to set up the Dark Depths combo, but also able to protect itself or the eventual Merit to Lodge token that the deck attempts to win with. Since its initial printing over a decade ago, Knight of the Reliquary has remained a prominent threat, and without a doubt the most impactful Knight ever printed in Magic the Gathering. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other Knight cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.